A single tariff can shake an entire industry. A trade war, on the other hand, can reshape the global economy. Canada is the largest export market for 34 U.S. states, stretching as far south as Mississippi and Florida. Each Canadian province and territory has its own unique trade ties with various American states, making the U.S.-Canada relationship one of the most deeply integrated economic partnerships in the world. But what started as a simple trade dispute has spiraled into a high-stakes standoff, one that threatens industries, jobs, and even the cost of everyday goods. Yet, for all the uncertainty President Trump has introduced, he isn't the first U.S. leader to use tariffs as a weapon. He follows a long line of predecessors who have wielded trade barriers to push Washington's agenda on the global stage. The United States and Canada have historically shared a strong relationship built on trade, security, and diplomacy. So, how did we reach this point of economic friction? And more importantly, where do we go from here? This isn't the first time tariffs have reshaped economies and triggered global trade wars. History has shown that when powerful nations impose economic barriers, the consequences ripple far beyond their borders. Take 1929, for example. The Wall Street crash sent the world into the Great Depression, and in response, the U.S. government sought to protect domestic industries. President Herbert Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Act in 1930, raising tariffs on agricultural and industrial goods by 20%. Because of this, Canada, France, and Spain retaliated with tariffs of their own, dealing a heavy blow to U.S. exports. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, Canada alone targeted 16 U.S. products, which accounted for nearly a third of U.S. exports at the time. Decades later, in 1982, the U.S. and Canada clashed again, this time over softwood lumber. The U.S. argued that Canada's government-controlled pricing system gave its lumber industry an unfair advantage over American producers, who relied on private land. This caused decades of tariff battles and retaliatory measures, with Canadian lumber facing a 25% U.S. tariff today, even before Trump's threats of additional duties. Despite the ongoing conflict, the U.S. still imports nearly half of its wood from Canada, according to the Observatory of Economic Complexity. The pattern continued into the 21st century. In 2002, President George W. Bush imposed tariffs on foreign steel to boost domestic production, triggering a backlash from Europe. While Canada and Mexico were exempt, the move intensified trade tensions worldwide. Then came Trump. His presidency from 2016 to 2020 was defined by aggressive trade policies, starting in 2018 when he slapped tariffs on solar panels and washing machines, both major industries for China, the world's largest solar panel producer. The trade war escalated in June 2018, when Trump imposed 25% tariffs on over 800 Chinese products, prompting China to retaliate with a 178% tariff on U.S. sorghum. The tit-for-tat continued, with China targeting soybeans and aircraft, while Trump levied 25% tariffs on steel and 10% on aluminum from Canada, Mexico, and the EU. Canada, like China, hit back by placing 25% tariffs on various U.S. imports. By 2019, the U.S.-China trade war was in full swing, with both sides suffering economic losses. The U.S.-China trade war had cost thousands of jobs and reshuffled trade alliances. China even lost its position as America's top trading partner to Mexico. Despite a January 2020 truce, the trade war didn't end. When President Biden took office in 2021, he extended Trump's solar panel tariffs in 2022, though the washing machine tariffs expired in 2023. The economic toll was quite severe. According to economists Katie Russ and Lydia Cox, the 2018 steel and aluminum tariffs caused 75,000 U.S. manufacturing job losses by mid-2019. Canada felt the pain too, with exports of steel to the U.S. falling nearly 40% in June 2018, while aluminum exports dropped by more than half, reaching their lowest levels in over a decade by May 2019. Now history is repeating itself, and the stakes are higher than the last time.
President Trump is placing new tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, including those from Canada and Mexico.
With Trump's new 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminum imports, including those from Canada, trade tensions are escalating yet again. If the White House follows through on its stacking tariff measures, Canadian steel and aluminum could face a total 50% tariff, a move that could destabilize manufacturing, construction, and supply chains across North America. Steel and aluminum are critical for industries like automotive manufacturing and construction. The last time the U.S. imposed similar tariffs, the effects were immediate and severe. Thousands of Canadian workers faced layoffs, businesses scrambled, and entire supply chains were disrupted. According to Babe Brusk, president of the Canadian Labour Congress, Trump's previous tariffs had a devastating impact, forcing 2,000 workers and 500 employers to rely on emergency government support. And yet, the U.S. depends heavily on Canadian aluminum. In 2024 alone, imports from Canada hit 3.2 million tons, twice the amount from the next 9 countries combined. Much of this supply comes from Quebec, where Premier François Legault is already hinting at countermeasures, suggesting that Canada could impose export tariffs on products like aluminum, a move that could pressure Washington given the U.S.'s reliance on Canadian supply. While Trudeau and Canadian officials are lobbying in Washington, history tells us that diplomacy alone may not be enough. Tariffs aren't just numbers on paper. They have real-world consequences. Let's look at how key industries are being hit, and few are as vulnerable as North America's deeply integrated automotive sector. A single car part may cross the US-Canada and US-Mexico borders up to 8 times before reaching final assembly per the Cato Institute. That means Trump's proposed 25% tariffs on motor vehicles and parts won't just affect finished cars, but every step of the supply chain. Canada and Mexico are the top sources of US motor vehicle imports and parts, and also major buyers of US automotive exports. Together, they account for nearly half of all US trade in this sector. Each time a component crosses into the US, manufacturers would have to pay a duty, piling on costs at every stage. Take the average price of a new car. $3,000 could be added to that price tag due to tariffs, per Wolf Research, with trucks and larger vehicles possibly seeing $10,000 hikes. The costs don't just impact consumers. They expose US companies to the risk of decreased sales in Canada and Mexico and the threat of retaliation. It doesn't stop with cars and parts. Steel is another major pain point. Today, Canada and Mexico supply about 40% of US steel mill product imports and over half of US flat steel imports, a major material for auto production. If Trump reinstates a 25% tariff on Canadian and Mexican steel, automakers will see input costs skyrocket, making US-produced cars even more expensive and less competitive. One argument for tariffs is that they help domestic industries by making foreign goods more expensive, allowing US producers to raise prices and expand production. But this boost is often temporary and unsustainable. New jobs created in protected industries often come at the expense of jobs in other sectors. In other words, higher costs make US companies less competitive globally. Without permanent protection, industries fail to sustain employment gains once tariffs are lifted. At the end of the day, tariffs don't really bring jobs back. They shift them inefficiently, creating short-term gains at the cost of long-term stability. While US tariffs threaten traditional auto manufacturing, Canada is making big moves in electric vehicle battery production. The country is quickly becoming a global leader in the EV battery ecosystem, building out domestic supply chains for essential materials like lithium, nickel, and cobalt. If trade barriers continue to disrupt traditional auto manufacturing, Canada's growing EV battery sector could give it a strategic advantage in the next phase of the industry. Canada is uniquely positioned in the global EV battery supply chain, thanks to its vast reserves of cobalt, graphite, lithium, and nickel, all essential for electric vehicle production. According to the Canadian Critical Minerals Strategy, Canada is one of few Western nations with all 4 in abundance, making it a key player in the clean energy transition. Beyond EVs, Canada is the world's 2nd largest producer of niobium used in aerospace and the 4th largest producer of indium, a crucial input for semiconductors and advanced vehicles. In total, Canada has identified 34 critical minerals that will drive future economies, with 21 already in production and further development opportunities on the horizon. This means that if tensions escalate, Canada could weaponize its critical mineral exports, which is something the US can't afford to ignore. Joanna Kiriasis, director at Clean Energy Canada, sees critical minerals as Canada's strongest card in the trade dispute, arguing that Washington's tariffs could backfire by pushing Canada to restrict access. "We have what the world needs and few other countries do," she told Canada's National Observer. But while Canada has leverage, it isn't holding the trump card. That belongs to China. China dominates the global critical minerals supply chain, processing over 60 to 70% of the world's lithium and cobalt, and controlling 90% of rare earth elements used in semiconductors. Beijing has already imposed export bans on some minerals and processing technologies in response to Western tariffs on Chinese EVs. This geopolitical squeeze could work in Canada's favor. With China restricting exports and Trump threatening new tariffs, the US may find itself increasingly dependent on Canada for lithium, cobalt, and rare earths. The International Energy Agency projects that the global critical minerals market could double in value to $770 billion by 2040, making Canada's role even more strategic. Investors are already reacting to the uncertainty. Tesla shares plunged 5.2%, leading a broader sell-off in EV and auto stocks, with General Motors and Toyota both down about 3%, and Stellantis dropping nearly 4%. This market reaction signals that tariffs carry real financial consequences. But beyond critical minerals, Canada's biggest leverage point is energy. The US is heavily dependent on Canadian oil, gas, and electricity, making energy trade a potential battleground. Canada is the world's fourth largest oil producer and sixth largest natural gas producer. Nearly all of its 4 million barrels per day of crude oil exports go to the US Midwest refineries process about 70% of these imports, making them highly vulnerable to supply disruptions. If Canada were to retaliate with export tariffs or restrictions, US refiners would be hit hard, especially those configured to process heavier grades of crude from Canada and Mexico. Phillips 66 has already warned that if tariffs take effect, Midwest and Rocky Mountain refineries may be forced to cut production due to the lack of alternative supplies. So far, Canada hasn't played this card, but could it be a last resort? With Trump's tariffs looming, Ottawa may have to decide how far it's willing to go. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is rallying Canadians, turning this trade war into a national unity battle. And it's working. 80% of Canadians say they'd never vote to merge with the US in the US. Even if such a wild idea came up, it would need approval from both chambers of Congress and a supermajority in the Senate, which is highly unlikely. Regardless, the real issue is Canada's economy is on edge. 3/4 of Canada's exports go straight to the US. That means any steep tariffs could hit Canadian businesses hard, risking thousands of jobs. Provincial leaders are pushing buy local campaigns to keep money within Canada. Some Canadians are canceling trips to the US as a form of protest. Meanwhile, companies on both sides of the border are holding their breath, wondering how bad things will get. This raises the big question: what's next for North America's economic future? Even if this trade war ended today, the damage is already done. Decades-old supply chains have been disrupted, and restoring them won't happen overnight. It could take years to rebuild what was lost. So, do you think this trade war is just political theater? Or are we on the verge of an economic crisis? Will Canada retaliate? And how will this shape global trade? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next one.